So I needed to have a saw that sat flush up against my wall. I needed to have more walk space. So I was looking at these zero clearance saws. Now there's a few others that are out there, but these are the two different ones that have the articulating arms. Now this Ridgid is made by the same company that makes the Delta Cruzer. I've contacted the factory and they verified it's the same, like the bearings and all that are the exact same part number. This was the original one. This one's been out for a while, tried and true. So which one is better? I don't know. So I got both of them here in the shop. I've been testing them out, trying to figure out just what is the difference because I was unable to find a head-to-head comparison of the two saws. Both saws are great saws. Both of them have different features, so it's all going to depend on what you're looking for. All right, so as of right now today, the Bosch is over at Lowe's for $5.99. Supposed to be there until January 31st is normally I think about $6.49, and the Ridgid is $5.49. So it's $50 more for the Bosch than the Ridgid as of today. So both saws, I've checked them, they're true, they give you a 90-degree cut. So that's important, but so we're kind of apples to apples on, out of the box, 90-degree cuts. So one of the features that a friend of mine had showed is on the Bosch down here, you have this big steel plate and it's got the detents. Now there's adjustment screws that you can loosen and rotate this if you need it to, adjust the angle for your miter. Although this one was dead on 90, and you've got your detents that are at 15, 22.5, 30, and 45. On the Ridgid, it has the same exact detents as the Bosch in the same spot, except for it's just this little aluminum plate that the detents pop into. So that one is definitely, the Bosch has a more robust system. One of the things that I was very disappointed with when I first pulled this Ridgid out of the box is this Ridgid just has these little pieces of pipes like the old Chicago Electric. If you ever had one of the old $100 Chicago Electric from Harbor Freight, this is the type of little extension wings that they came with. It was not what I would have expected for a big saw like this. However, on the Bosch, we have these little extension wings you can pull out and stop. Now, I have a Bauer that has these same style of wings, except for it has a little piece that flips up here as a stop. Bosch does have that, but you have to purchase that separately. It's got the screw holes here on the sides to where you can have your stop to flip up. So that in itself, is definitely, the Bosch is much better. So let's go. The whole purpose of this was I was needing a saw that was shorter. Now, these two saws are both about 12 inches shorter than my 10-inch Bauer was. Since the main purpose of this was to save room, when I measure from the back to the end of the knob right here, on the Bosch is 32 3/4 inch. When I measure on the Ridgid here, I'm getting 31 inches. So that's 1 3/4 inches shorter. However, when you go to rotate, the way this one is set up, and then whenever you're articulating arms, these arms actually go back past. So if you push this up against the wall and rotate it, it's about a 30-degree, and then push it back, the amount of space that you have to have away from the wall on this one was 32 inches, and on this one was 33 inches. So this one only sticks out 1 inch farther than what the Ridgid does whenever you place it as you would to use it, because this one, when it rotates out, it doesn't stick back past the saw like the Ridgid does. So as far as the cut capacity of the saw, whenever I put the saws up here, extended them fully out, and then this one right here is the Bosch, so this is fully cut. I did the same with the Ridgid, and as you can see, the cuts are almost identical in length away from the saw. However, if you noticed, this cut is longer, and that is because the Ridgid actually goes deeper into the wood, it goes below the wood, which what that results in is on the back side, because the angle is at a greater angle, it's causing more chip out on the back. So this is imported birch, it's real prone to chip out, but you see there's actually a significant more amount of chip out from the Ridgid than it is from the Bosch. Something that I found very peculiar is on the Bosch, when you measure from the blade to the edge of the saw, it's 13¼ inches on both sides, so you're about 26½ inches. Well, on the Ridgid here, when you measure from here to the edge is only 11 inches, and then on this side it's 13½ inches, so it's a total of 24¾ So for some reason on the Ridgid, the saw is off-centered, and your total table here is actually about 1¼ inch narrower than the Bosch. But if you're on the left side of your blade, you're going to be about 3 inches shorter on the Ridgid than on the Bosch. As far as our miters go, we can miter to the left on the Bosch 52 degrees and then 60 degrees to the right. On the Ridgid, we can miter to the left 50 degrees and 60 to the right. Not much of a difference, but the Bosch does have 2 degrees extra that you can miter to the left. On the Bosch, when we rotate over here to do our bevel, so their bevel seems to be a lot stiffer, but you have to pull that up, and then you have a pin up here on the front that you can pull in and lock. And now it will rotate to the left, and then it goes all the way to the stop at the 45. If I push that in, it'll rotate back over here, and then we stopped at 90. If I want to go to the right side, I have to pull this out, and then I got to rotate the arm on the right to then rotate back to the right. And now that is at a 33.9 and then 45. Those are the only two detents that you have on the Bosch, is the 33.9 and then the 45. And then we're back up to 90. So you pass the 90 and then come back, because it doesn't actually lock in at 90. So it just stops up there at 90. The Ridgid, on the other hand, you have to flip this lever up, which is spring loaded, so it's much easier to flip up, but then you actually have to reach back here on the back, flip that switch back to be able to pivot. Now, this pivots way easier than the Bosch does, but I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because you're not really beveling that much and then trying to get it pinpointed. However, over here, we have the same 33.9, 45 degree, but then they also have the 22.5 degree detent that will lock in. So, and that's on left and right. So you have an extra detent on either side on your bevel with the Ridgid. Now, one of the things that I did not like with the Ridgid is whenever I bevel the Ridgid, you got to pull your wings all the way back. That's the same on basically both of them. Let me go ahead and pull this off so you can really see this good. But whenever you bevel this over here at a 45, if you're reaching out right here, this arm comes out. So if you have a long board that you have to fully extend, you have only about 1.75 inches that will fit underneath this little assembly there, because if not, it'll push that board out. Now, if you're a shorter board, you can get an extra ½ inch or so. On the Bosch, it's about the same on the right because it's got a thing, but then on the left over here, same as with the Ridgid, you got to pull that wing almost all the way out. We'll pivot this down to our 45. But see, we don't have, all we've got is the dust chute here, which gives us a lot greater of a clearance to do a 45 bevel on the left side. But again, on the right is about the same because you have your mechanism up here. So by far, neither one of these saws are lightweight saws to be just packing around. The Ridgid is 59 pounds, whereas the Bosch is 65 pounds. Only a 6 pounds difference, but it is 6 pounds heavier for the Bosch. So the saw itself, I don't know for what reason, but with the Ridgid, when you hit the trigger, this thing has a tendency to really jump up hard, whereas there's a little bit of a jump up with the Bosch, but not near about as hard as it is on the Ridgid. When you come to the handle, the Bosch has a real big handle, so that may be a deal breaker if you've got little hands. I've got big hands, so I have no problems. And see, I can reach over here and I can push with my thumb. The safety slides. But if I'm on the other side, I can actually push the safety back the other direction. And then there's just one big handle that goes all the way across, so I'm using all 4 of my fingers to squeeze. However, on the Ridgid, it's got a much smaller handle, so my hand barely fits inside of it. And then you've got a little pull trigger on the right, and then this is the trigger to give it power. So you have to push that one down first and then push this one down. So, and the way it is, it makes it to where you're grabbing with your pinky to try to pull this left one. So it's a lot more difficult, which you should be standing in front of the saw when you're cutting it. But if you did have a board and you needed to reach over with your left hand, this saw definitely is much more difficult. Now, a thing that's almost a deal breaker for me is this saw has the shadow line, and if you haven't used a shadow line, you don't know what you're missing. Whenever you go to cut with this saw, you got a switch up here on the top, and when you turn it on, it puts a shadow of the blade exactly where the blade's going to go. And so it doesn't matter if you're on the left or the right, it's going to take out the material where the shadow is, and that is a fantastic feature. I think all saws should have that. The Bosch doesn't have any of that. Doesn't have a laser, doesn't have a shadow line, nothing. It's just the old school. Whereas they have a spot made into the housing where they could put a shadow line. So I don't know why they built in the housing but have not included that. It was like, I don't know, a future feature that they were going to do, but they didn't have it. So that alone was almost a reason enough for me to go with the Ridgid over the Bosch. However, we're going to test the deflection. There's been a lot of discussions when these came out about the deflection, how much deflection, which is when you pull the saw all the way out, and if you're not perfectly square and going straight down, if you're pulling to an angle a little bit, how much will you pull the blade off?
I went ahead and I took my dial indicator and placed it directly in line with the arbor, measured up about 3 inches. Then I attached my scale here to my bench vise. That way, as I cranked out the vise, I had some control over how much pressure I put on the vise. It went out to about 5 pounds, 4 ounces. You know, this little scale, it would lock in. So then that gave me 18 thousandths of an inch deflection. So I went over here, restarted the scale up, cranked it back out. I was trying to get about 7 pounds, and it went into 7 pounds, 5 ounces. So then I went back and looked, and I was at 26 thousandths of an inch of deflection. So I went over here, swapped out the saws, put the Ridgid saw on the table, and then tried to run the same test to see if there was a big difference. So as you can see here, I cranked it out, and I was trying to get 5 pounds, and it showed 5 pounds, and when I dropped the handle down on the vise, it actually loosened up just a little bit to just over 4 pounds. And as you can see here, I still have 40 thousandths of an inch of deflection, you know, with somewhere between 4 pounds, 1.2 ounces or so. So I went ahead, cranked it on up, and it locked in about 5 pounds, 9 ounces. So then at that, I had 58 thousandths of an inch. compared to the 26 thousandths of an inch that I had on the Bosch. And I didn't notice it until I was editing the video. If you look back, the blade was actually touching. This was a zero clearance, and you can see how much has been eaten out. And I was trying to point out to my buddy that's filming, look at that. So the blade was actually up against the zero clearance fence, which means that it would have actually been out a lot more had I not had that zero clearance fence. And you see me with one finger just pushing to the side how much that dial indicator is jumping back and forth.
Basically, it's what's important to you as to which saw you would buy. So for me, even though this one has a few more niceties with the shadow line, the accuracy is more important for me, and I'm going to be sticking with the Bosch. So if you have either one of these saws or the Delta Cruzer, put it in the comments of what you think, if you agree with this comparison, or if you don't, let me know, and maybe I missed something. Until then, I appreciate you watching.